Do you want to learn the tricks that top leaders use to get the most out of themselves and their teams? Well, Naftali Hoff is here to help. Lead to succeed. Picks the brains of top leaders to learn about their challenges, insights, and best practices. Here's Naftali.
Hello, Lead to Succeed Nation. It's Naftali Hoff, and welcome to Lead to Succeed, episode 148. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Nigel Thurlow. Nigel is the CEO of the Flow Consortium and one of the most sought-after speakers and experts in lean, agile, and flow methods. He was Toyota's first Chief of Agile, where he co-created the flow system and the award-winning Scrum the Toyota Way approach. Nigel has trained over 8,500 people in Scrum, Agile, Lean, Flow, and complexity approaches, and his coaching portfolio includes GE, Bose, 3M, Microsoft, Vodafone, Lumen, Cox Automotive, and MIT. He's a member of Forbes Invite-Only Coaches Council organization and is due to be listed in the Who's Who of America later this year. Nigel has co-authored many peer-reviewed papers and books on methods and approaches to accelerate business transformation, including the renowned The Flow System series. He is a highly sought-after international keynote speaker and will appear on the TV series Advancements, which will feature on Bloomberg and Amazon Prime. It actually seems to have already done in June 2024. And we're recording this in August, so I guess I'm a little late to the party. Either way, Nigel, glad to have you on the show today.
Hey, it's a pleasure, and you've done a lot of these, and it's a real honor to be with you.
My pleasure, and it's an honor to have you as well. So congratulations, by the way, on all of this, and this last piece, the TV series, very exciting as well. So Nigel, you do have to tell us, I know you are from the UK, and now you're residing in the Lone Star State. Curious to know your backstory. How did you get to where you are today?
Wow, I'll try and give you the short version of it. And yes, I live north of Dallas now, thanks to my beautiful wife, who enabled me to live in this amazing country. But I started off in project management. In fact, I started off in electrical engineering many moons ago, found my way into the computing industry because I stumbled in when we were still using binary punch tape and things of that nature, which some of the listeners will have no idea what I'm talking about, bless them. No idea at all. But then I sort of found that moving from being a technician to managing technicians was paid better. And then I figured out this project management thing was paid better than the managers of the support department. So I sort of stumbled my way into these different things. And then I was living in Belgium. I was working for a major US corporation, Comcast. Many people know them. And I was living in Belgium. They'd relocated me from the UK there. And the telecoms crash came. And this was around 2001, 2002, when the big telecoms sort of crash and subsequent recession. And then I was like, what am I going to do? And I was this really clever project manager, or so I thought. So I went and knocked on the door of Toyota because they were looking for some project managers. And I ended up being recruited into the enterprise architecture team as an enterprise architect because I'd got that background, but with project management. And then for the next 6 months, I was resigning every single day of the week because I thought these people were crazy. I thought their methods and approach were absolutely unbelievably difficult to learn. And the way they did things was just counterintuitive. We commonly call this the Toyota way. And so for 6 months, I was resigning. Then suddenly one day it clicked. I suddenly went, now I get it. And then I spent the next 5 years being deeply trained in how the Toyota production system, the Toyota way, and the way Toyota people think. And it completely transformed my focus, my belief, my whole attitude towards doing things, and transformed my career. So then after a few years at Toyota, I was moving to the US because I'd met my now wife, and I had been sort of working on all this agile stuff that was out there in the software development industry and the digital industry, and looking at things like Scrum and other techniques within the agile sort of realms, plus things like extreme programming techniques, software development approaches. And I got to the US and I started hanging out with some folks that were in this line of work. And I was doing some independent consulting, and I ended up doing some consulting for a guy by the name of Jeff Sutherland, one of the co-creators of Scrum. And that enabled me to work with some really good US organizations like GE, some of the organizations you mentioned in that very elaborate introduction. Thank you. And so I'd started working with them for a while, and I was in Jeff's office one day, and then this company called and said, we're interested in learning a bit about Scrum. And that company was Toyota. And of course, I knew a lot of the people because of my past career with them in Europe. And long story short, I ended up in California a few weeks later, delivering a leadership workshop for some of the top brass at Toyota, explaining the synergies between TPS, Toyota Production System, and Scrum, and sort of this agile world and the things that we talk about in the Toyota way. And I sort of showed how these came together in a more symbiotic way. And indeed, a lot of the principles that people in the agile world talk about are firmly rooted in Toyota Production System and lean thinking from Toyota. And then that started a journey where I led a team into Toyota as a consultant at that time, helping them start to use some of these agile techniques alongside the things that they were the best in the world at. And that eventually led to me being hired back as their first Chief of Agile at Toyota. And then I spent some time with them, developed what you mentioned earlier on, Scrum the Toyota Way, which was really just a way of explaining where Scrum fits with the way Toyota do things, and that symbiosis between the approaches. It's sort of an and, not an or. It's this and this, not this or this. And that led to us starting to think about what we call the flow system now, which was research I did with Toyota and the University of North Texas. And in essence, we started to realize that there were lots of areas that were isolated, like leadership theories, team science theories, complexity theories, and of course, the whole lean thinking background, and then the whole agile industry, which sort of sits somewhere between complexity and ordered systems. And that led us to evolve what became the flow system in the original published papers. And about the end of 2019, just before COVID, so it wasn't the best planning in the world, I decided to leave Toyota for the final time and actually go and focus my attentions on the work we were doing around what became the flow system. So that's a 5-minute version of 12 or 15 years.
Okay. So there are parts of it that I understood and made a lot of sense to me. There are pieces that are obviously much more technical in nature
Sure.
that I'm not as involved with. So for those who are as ill-informed as myself, or perhaps even more so in some regards, what would you say are the, well, let's try to make this as practical as we can, because this is a leadership podcast. So not everybody's going to want to get into the nitty-gritty of how let's say Toyota or any of the companies you referenced are going to work through all of their processes. But whether it's using the Toyota way or using the flow system, or perhaps maybe each of them in their own respective space, what would you say are some of the, I don't want to call it 30,000-foot view pieces of it, but are there some overarching steps, values, areas of consideration that you have learned in all of this work and consulting that you have done, that the average leadership, the average person in leadership, whether they're in management, whether on the executive level, small business, larger corporations, nonprofits, you name it, are there certain things that have risen to the top for you that every leader should know this because I see that it works, or I see that it doesn't work and they should avoid this, whether it's communication related or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key things, and one of the phrases I use a lot nowadays, is we don't have a methodology problem, we have a behavior problem. So a lot of organizations, a lot of the leaders that are listening into your show will resonate with the fact that we go through these continuous transformational initiatives. We hire in the large consulting firms. We then decide we're going to move from this method or this approach or this way of working to some new way of working. And then what ensues is a multi-million-dollar campaign of training and coaching and shifting us from left to right to a new methodology. And it's always a methodology approach. It's case-based, it's prescriptive. But what we've started to discover, actually, case-based approaches don't work. We now need to be context-based. So we can't copy-paste what works successfully in a hospital or a manufacturer and stick it into a bank or an educational institute, because the context is very different. So context is key. What we also recognize is the methods and techniques we use, methods, tools, techniques, approaches, have what's called bounded applicability. Very fancy phrase, which means they have context-related utility. So if you try and use a technique in a context which it's not well designed for, it won't be very effective. So when you take a case-based approach and put it into a different context, you don't get the results you expect. So we started focusing a lot on human factors. So things like distributed leadership, we may translate that to empowerment, to psychological safety. Some of these phrases that are becoming more prevalent and well-known because of work from Dr. Amy Edmondson and people like that. And we're starting to realize that we need to focus on the attitude and approach and how we treat our people, because that's actually where the best results we get within organizations when we're trying to solve a challenge, solve a problem. We have a gap. We've identified a gap. And so we're now thinking about what are we going to do to close that gap to make us more successful, make us more performant, make us more attractive in the market. So we're starting to realize that we don't have a methods approach. We have lots of methods, lots of tools, techniques, approaches. We have lots of prescriptive ways of working. But actually what we're finding is that that's not where the issue is. It's our attitudes and approaches, our behaviors. And actually culture is a product of our behaviors. So if we don't like the culture we're working in, throwing new methods at it isn't really going to help. We need to look at the behaviors, the attitudes, the approaches, and how we do what we do. And a lot of leaders complain to me. They'll tell me things like, hey, Nigel, these are all the problems we've got. Costs are up. Revenue or profits are down. We've got staff or employee attrition or customer attrition. Customers aren't adopting our products and services and so on. And my refrain is always, they are not problems, they are outcomes. So if you've got outcomes or results that are undesirable, you need to go look at how you do what you do. Because unless you truly understand how you do what you do, those are the results you're going to achieve. But it's not a methodology problem. It really is. Do you trust your people? If you don't trust your people, you have a different problem. We need to solve that first. If you trust your people, why don't you give them the permission to act, the agency and the voice to own the decision making and actually own the decisions that are necessary to move the needle forward? So these are some of the lessons we've learned, and that's irrespective of, allegiance to any methodology or any practice or any background, whether it's Toyota or whether it's an agile approach or whether it's something you've been taught by Deloitte or Accenture or whoever is giving you something. These are sort of, if we put that aside and we look just at the context you're in and how the system is working and the results the system are producing, if you don't like the results, those outcomes, there's something wrong with the way the system is functioning. And that's predominantly human factors, not a methodology.
Interesting. So there are a couple of things I would say that I'd like to drill down on. Originally, I was going to ask you about change management, because I do think that you talked about changing systems, et cetera. We know how difficult change is for people. But then you talked about culture and you mentioned trust. And I think that those two are more, in many ways, more interconnected, though obviously they will affect how change is implemented within an organization. So what has been your experience for people who are not satisfied with the culture? And I'm going to ask the question from both ends. I'm going to ask it from the leadership side, where, you might, maybe you're demystifying or lifting the curtain for them and saying, hey, you guys you have a culture problem here. Or maybe they recognize it on their own. That's on the top down, for lack of a better term, perspective. But the other alternative, in this, and this is not only for managers who lead up, but it's even for direct reports. Anyone who leads up, you're working in an environment, the culture doesn't feel right. There are trust issues, et cetera. It's interesting because with my mastermind group, just yesterday, we started on Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. And so we started with habit number 1, be proactive. And we talked about how there are things that are, in your circle of concern, they're really not anything you could affect, but there are plenty of areas in your circle of influence that you could affect. You just need to know the approach by which to do so. You have to trust that if you are doing it the right way, good things will come out of it. How do you advise people on both sides of this continuum to enhance the culture, maybe to build trust and trustworthiness within an organization. And then maybe we'll see where that affects us in terms of a change conversation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting problem. And I was making some notes. Covey's work's very good, by the way. It's work I've read and enjoy immensely. So maybe I'll take it from as well. I'll explain when I engage with an organization. The first thing I do is I always talk to the most senior leadership, because if I can't engage with senior leadership, then it's very difficult to affect change below that senior
Very
leadership.
difficult. Yeah, without question.
So if they're not participatory and engaged, we have a challenge to begin with. The other thing when I'm talking to people that are lower down that pecking order, the managers, the people who are operating the organization, the operational aspect, the famous middle management, I often say to them, look, there are certain things your senior leaders are going to look for. They're going to identify. And I was running a problem-solving session just last week in Atlanta, and I started to explain what a problem was. It's a gap between where we are, the current situation, and a situation we'd like to be in, an ideal or a target situation. That's the gap. But I said, how are you going to quantify that? Because you've all got lots of complaints. We did an exercise where they put a lot of problems on the wall. They explained all the different things that were challenging them. And I said, but you need to articulate them in a way that attracts the attention of the senior leadership team. For instance, the CFO is always going to look at things that cost money. So if you can put a dollar amount on that, you will always get the attention of the CFO. They're going to be very interested in why creating these problems, and I'm trying to avoid some of the technical examples, but why these problems we're creating are costing us money and pain. What's the pain we're suffering? But if you don't have that senior leadership attention or engagement, the ability for you to change things, you mentioned the circle of influence. So our 3 circles, the stuff we've got direct impact over, we can do,
Yep.
the stuff we may influence, and the things outside of our control. But if you don't have the leadership attention, it's going to be very difficult to do anything other than what's in your direct circle of influence. Now, the next thing I get into is this whole Japanese concept of continuous improvement. People use the word Kaizen. It's a little bit of a deeper meaning, but it traditionally translates to try something new. So what can we do that's something different? What can you as a leader do at your level to improve the environment in which you have control over? You have a certain amount of influence you have direct control in the circle you're in, but then you've got influence in the next level out. What can you do that will result in some form of noticeable improvement? 1% Kaizen, it's sometimes described as. What are those small nudges we can make in the system to create a different outcome? What are the behaviors we're seeing? What are the behaviors you can nudge? We use a phrase in complexity thinking, more like this, less like that. So we can detect the types of behaviors or influences in the environment, and then determine how we can nudge more of the behaviors that we want and less of the ones we don't want. But the reality of it is, if you have a senior leadership team that are not engaged, that don't recognize the problem, that aren't willing to come and actually be part of messaging that to the people who are trying to make the change, then it's going to be extremely difficult for any real systemic change to occur. And then you get into issues that Deming talked about in quality, which is sub-optimizing the system. So you go and apply a bunch of improvements in your own area, but then if you're part of an extended system, you create a sub-optimization, either upstream or downstream. Either the upstream can't keep up with you or the downstream is overwhelmed. So this is where we really need to make sure that we're engaging those senior leaders. And there's no magic to this. There's no instant way to do this other than, can we make visible to the senior leadership why the problem is something they should be interested in, and measure it and quantify it in a way that they'd be interested in, so they will engage. But often I work with a lot of leaders that knows those middle layers, which have more or less given up. They've just accepted that it is what it is. The system is where it's at. They're not really able, or they don't feel able to fight that system in their environment. And so we have to spend a lot of time coaching those leaders to identify opportunities to make things visible, so we can bring that senior leadership into the conversation.
Wow. I mean, minimally in all that you shared, and there was a lot, one thing that I think really rose to the top for me, and this is something that certainly emerges a lot in my mastermind group as well, is the fact that so many issues associated with running a business, running an organization, have nothing to do with the processes per se, or what it is that you're there to do. So for example, my background is in education. I reference that often, you know, in conversations like this. And so I went from the classroom to administrative, eventually became a headmaster. And what oftentimes principals don't really realize, at least to the extent of it, is how much their role is no longer about being a great educator. You know, yes, it's good to know what the components of a great lesson are, how to walk into a classroom, how to identify what's working and what isn't, be that technician. But what you really need to do is be able to build people and to be able to manage the inevitable conflicts and issues and, you know, emotional drama that goes on when you're dealing with kids and adults, and sometimes adults that act like kids, and all that stuff that goes on, parents too. And you're doing so much people management. And the same thing is true for, you know, when we do our hot seat and people bring problems to the group, yes, they have questions about how to price their services, you know, approaches to marketing themselves effectively, how to tell your story. All of that is great. But a lot of times people are saying, I'm struggling with this client. I'm struggling with this person on my team. And a lot of it really comes down to people. And so my question to you, as I guess a spin-off of that, I know you coach and I know you train. Ideally, and I do this too. And so and I have these conversations with people. I say, I really hope that we are able to identify ways by which, if I come in, for example, to your school and I work with your educators, or I come into your office and I work with your sales professionals. So I do a training on overcoming call reluctance coming up very soon, right? I want to make sure it's not a one and done. Even if you're fully engaged for the 60, 90, 2-hour session that I'm providing, you know, eventually I'm off the radar. People are going back to work. How do you sustain it? So I'm just curious to know, since we really want leaders to have coaching capacities, we want leaders to be able to train others, or at least to create infrastructures within their own organizations where there's ongoing training, even if you're not bringing external consultants into the building. What would you say are some of the, first of all, how do you see the difference between the two? And what would you say are some things that everybody can and should be doing in a leadership position so that they're doing more to develop their people as well as nurture relationships with them?
So you packed a lot into that sort of
I know.
preamble for this question.
I kept going as I kept adding more to it. I realized
I'm going to unpack a little bit of that, because you said you're
Sure.
a teacher. So one of the things we use is behavioral markers, which come out of education. That's a real common thing. And I urge anybody to sort of just Google behavioral markers, because they help you to set the type of behaviors you'd like to see, and then help you to guide what we mean by that type of behavior, and then enable you as a leader or as a leadership coach to be able to see how you are doing towards creating those behaviors we want to amplify. So that was a thing I picked up. And one of this, and I'll paraphrase because I won't remember the precise wording of the quote, but E.G. Toyota, one of the creators of what became Toyota's production system over the years, he said, we build cars, but first we build people. So Toyota's philosophy has always been about OJD, on the job development, which is different to training within industry. We can go into a classroom, learn something, go back and back to normal life when all the inspiration ebbs away because real life hits us again. But on the job development is how you as a leader, coach, mentor, develop your people continuously within the workplace. And Dave Markane turned the ship around, and various other, and work by Hert Hofstede in the Netherlands of the Power Distance Index. They talk about two pillars of empowering your people: clarity and competency. Clarity is, do we know the right thing to do, the right ethics, the right decision? Do we know how to make the right decision? Competency is, do we have the right skills to do the work, and can we be left and trusted to actually complete the work? And if we look as leaders and we look at our people and we recognize that we lack either of those, or some or both of them, then we failed as a leader. Because the Toyota sort of approach to this is if you fail, it's my fault. What could I have done better? What could I have done more of? How could I have helped create the right environment? So we don't fix people, we fix the environment. We create the environment for people to thrive. But then I have to look at, well, what have I let you down in helping you understand what is the right thing to do? What are the right decisions to make? How have I let you down in the way that I haven't provided you with the requisite training and skilling and an ongoing coaching to develop your competencies? And leader and leadership are different constructs. Leaders follow me, I'm the leader. Leadership is more a collective social construct, which is we are together in this, we are developing together, and my senior level of skills or experience is why I'm in this position to help you thrive within this system, not just survive within this system. There's another technique which comes out of the complexity world called sense making. And without going into a lot of detail about how to do that, it's really how do you make sense of the world so you can act in it. And so there are techniques that leaders can learn for them to sense the environment. You may spot behaviors, but aren't really sure why those behaviors are there. We'll call those dark constraints. So there are techniques which allow us to understand why we see what we see, but we don't know why it's there. And I often describe this as how do you know what you need to know before you need to know it? So there are techniques that leaders can learn to enable them to see what they don't currently see. And there's another term we use called inattentional blindness, which is where you don't see what you're not looking for. It's the gorilla experiment. The gorilla runs on, jumps around a baseball court and runs off, and nobody knows that, basketball court, nobody knows the gorilla was there. So that's inattentional blindness. So how do you see what's in your adjacent possibles, in your peripheral? So there are techniques that leaders can learn to become better at seeing these things, spotting these things, and then designing interventions within the system to actually develop their people. But to your key point, if you don't develop your people, it doesn't matter how much you throw at them in the way of process and methodology and format and prescriptive frameworks, you won't get a better result. It all starts with developing your people. I don't know, did I catch all your points? Maybe I missed one or two.
I don't even remember what all of them were, so let's say yes. Let's say yes. Definitely a lot of goodness there. And I think you just reiterated certainly what I was getting at in the question is that, again, people don't typically become leaders because they set out to be a leader. For the most part, they get promoted. And with that promotion, you can often lose sight of the fact that your role is different. You move from me to we is how I often refer to it. Because until that point in time, I was all about trying to do my very best, get promoted, get recognized. But now it's no longer the me that gets, that's important in terms of metrics of success. It's ultimately the group, the team, the organization, the company that needs to perform at a higher level. And so you move from being a great producer to a great motivator and visionary and communicator. And for some people, especially the technical people, for whom interpersonal skills may not be as developed, that's a tall order. At the same time, the only way to get better at it is through practice as well as self-awareness. With my coaching, I usually talk about awareness and accountability. What needs to change? What are the issues? You talked about in different language, same concept. And then, of course, the accountability of following through. So I think we hit on a lot. I would love to end this segment with a question. It's a vulnerable question, but it's a question I ask all of my guests. And the reason I ask it is because, you have been speaking, about a variety of different things. Anybody who's meeting you now for the first time in our conversation, I would imagine is deeply impressed with your intelligence, ability to articulate, knowledge of systems, etc. And so you kind of assume a person to be where you first encounter them, which is smart and successful. The reality is we don't, right? Every winner was once a beginner. So, and sometimes in that process, there are mistakes, maybe even big mistakes that we make that we see at the time as being egregious errors, but over time, we with the benefit of hindsight, become sometimes some of our best moments because they created awareness, they repivoted our direction, whatever it might have looked like. I'm curious to know, Nigel, what was a big mistake or a challenging moment for you that transitioned you ultimately, or helped transition you along a better path moving forward?
I love the question, and yes, of course, I'll answer it, because showing fallibility and vulnerability is one of the key aspects of being a good leader, and we teach this in a lot of our classes and our teaching and the stuff we work on, because a leader isn't a job title. You're not promoted to be a leader, even though we use those terms in American commerce and elsewhere. There's this concept of followership. So to be a leader, you need followers, and leadership is a set of characteristics which you emerge through. And then, of course, you gain followers. And one of the things about being seen as an expert in something, and I don't know if it's one of the biases from Kahneman and Tversky, but what knowledge acquisition bias is the way I describe it. We forget how hard it was for us to learn what we learned. And we just assume that what we know is really simple, and why can't all these people just get it and grasp it? And so I suffered with that for a while. As much as I suffered with being the big I am, I would I would deliver all these training classes. And even at Toyota, you mentioned I'd trained thousands of people, and that is true, and it keeps going up. Thankfully, people still want to listen to me. But I had a fantastic team around me. And I still have a fantastic team around me. But in the early days in Toyota, when I was doing all this stuff, I was at the front of the classroom. I was singing and dancing and, and performing, and everybody was listening and hanging on every word. And I had all these really, really talented people who I'd developed, but I wasn't giving them the microphone. I was keeping control, because I had to learn to trust and to empower. And the best thing I ever did, and I say this many times, the best thing I ever did was get out of the way. I was in the way. And once I got out of the way, it didn't mean that my team went and was able to do everything exactly as I did it, because they shouldn't do. They shouldn't try and be me and copy me. They need to be themselves and adapt and evolve to deliver the similar messages, but in their unique style and their unique presentation methods, etc. But and it wasn't that they could do it as well as me immediately, but if I didn't give them that chance to learn and didn't give them that safe to fail space, they'd never improve. So the biggest lesson for me, and the biggest mistake I made, was being the guy at the front of the room all the time. I needed to get out of the way, and I actually stopped going to the events. I didn't even turn up to say hello. I let them run it themselves, and we were able to expand. We were able to sort of cover more people. We were able to deliver messages in different ways. And sometimes actually they delivered the message better than me, because they connected with the people better, and they had better language or better ways of explaining things. And I actually started to learn from them. So it was a big challenge for me to sort of get over that hump. But then when I did, I realized that all the things we're talking about here about developing people and moving, you described it from the me to the we. So it's no longer about me, me, me. In fact, I'm not the important person anymore. I should be in the background, supporting, coaching, mentoring, developing the people who are in the foreground. It's all about the we, no longer about the me. And that's a key lesson from Japan. Japanese society is all about the we, never about the me.
Awesome. So we're now going to transition to rapid fire. The first question I've got for you is something that you would do different as your 25-year-old self.
Oh, I would stop going out and wasting as much money and time on party, and realize that 50 and 60 comes up real fast.
Real fast. 3 action steps that every leader should do every day.
Well, we talk about leader standard work. So you should definitely check in with your people and your teams every single day and listen. So that's number 1. Number 2 is you should practice active listening. Okay. Yep. And number 3, you should continuously examine what you can do better to improve the environment for those people to thrive in.
Nice. The one person that has the most helped you to get to where you are today.
Wow, there's a whole list of characters there, but if I was, I would really call out my very first general manager, who unfortunately is no longer with us at Toyota. His name was Tim Platt. He was the person who really helped me in the beginning, and if he hadn't set me in the right direction, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today.
I have a feeling I know the answer. 10 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. The importance of a coach or mentor.
Oh, a 10 for sure. I need coaches and mentors. Even I have people I rely on day to day to help me make decisions.
If you had an hour with one person who you could never otherwise meet, could be a historical figure, who would that person be?
Ooh, I would like to have met Taiichi Ono. I mean, it's cliche because of my Toyota background, but he is the one person I'd love to have spent a lot of time with. I've spent time with his proteges, but I'd love to have spent time with the man behind all of this madness that I
Man behind.
work in. Yeah.
And finally, a productivity tip, Nigel, that helps you to get more done.
Post-it notes.
Post-it notes.
Yeah, I mean, so I use a visual control system to be able to map out. Once I've written it on a post-it note, whether it's digital or physical, and look, I have a pile on the table I've been writing while we've been talking.
Okay.
But once I've written it on one of these, it's out of my head and I never forget it. And it means I'm no longer overwhelmed by the thoughts in my head trying to remember things.
Yeah, writing things down is important. I talk about it in my trainings. Okay, so Nigel, how can people, you've shared so much already, people are interested in learning more, connecting with you, maybe benefiting from your training. How can they find you and learn more about your work?
They want to learn more about me, it's just my name.com, nigelthurlow.com. They want to learn more about the work we do as the Flow System and Flow Consortium, flowconsortium.com.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the material we produce is free. It's available for people to obtain. We've got flowguides.org and getflowtrained.com. I'm sure that'll all be in the notes of the podcast, but they're different websites that have a lot of information. And the last one has a lot of free available things. A lot of the stuff we published in the playbook, we actually made a lot of this content available free of charge for people to download. There's worksheets, there's study guides, they can go and help themselves. And we did that because there's a lot of people in the world that don't have the money to be able to afford to buy the books like we do in the US.
Sure, of course. Okay, Nigel, one last thing I'm going to ask of you before we wrap up, and that's for a final life lesson, something that inspires you, something that you think, could just be a nice way to wrap up our conversation.
It's really simple. I'm 61, nearly 62, and as you get older, things start to fail, and you start to become more aware of your mortality. So don't waste life at work. Find a way to balance your life and your working life, and actually focus on the things you really want to do in life. Don't leave it too late. Tomorrow is too late. Start thinking about the things you really want to achieve and do them now. And I'm now starting to think about the things I want to do so that I can actually get them done before it's too late. So start now. Don't put it off till tomorrow.
Nice. And if I could just add to that, I always record my podcast on Fridays, which is a slower day for me. So it's just easier. And as an observant Jew, Friday night is always the beginning of our Sabbath. And
Indeed.
The Sabbath creates an opportunity for pause, for reflection, to think about. So you've certainly given me much to think about. I've enjoyed the conversation immensely, and I can't wait to share this with my followers. So thank you very much, Nigel, for being with us, and continue to do the great work you're doing.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode and for investing in yourself so that you can lead to succeed. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Your feedback gives the show more social proof and encourages more folks to listen.